Dr. Malone, would you say there is a COVID-19 pandemic?
Pandemics are in the eye of the beholder. They're kind of nebulous. What is the definition of a pandemic? As far as I'm concerned, we certainly have had a worldwide outbreak and spread of a novel coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2. The pathogenicity of that was really not very severe. If we are going to call this a pandemic, we're going to have to call a lot of other things pandemics also. And certainly the risks associated with this outbreak are nowhere near those of a potential pneumonic Ebola virus, for instance. So the risks of this particular virus have clearly been overestimated by the Imperial College in London and many others. And at this point in time, I think that we no longer have a public health emergency, which is perhaps a more appropriate question. Did we ever have a public health emergency? Maybe at some point in time, certainly up until the evolution of Omicron. But after the development and evolution of Omicron, I don't think we can make a strong case that we have a public health emergency anymore.
Thank you. What would you say to the question regarding, is it right to mass vaccinate children?
Regarding mass vaccination of children, there's no clear answer. And I think this has been one of the misconceptions all the way through this. Any medical intervention needs to rigorously take into account risk and benefit. And if, for instance, going back to that example, if there was an outbreak of a pneumonic Ebola, just to take one example, I'm not trying to scare people, I'm using this as an extreme example. So if we had a highly pathogenic, rapidly lethal virus that was spread through respiratory means, then even a suboptimal vaccine might be justified for mass vaccination in children. It's a question of what is the risks of the pathogen, the medical event, and what are the risks of the potential product or mitigation. Unfortunately, with these products, we don't know really. We're just learning the short-term risks and intermediate-term risks, and we have little understanding of what the long-term risks, including the long-term risks to children, are. So we really can't make a risk-benefit evaluation that's responsible. But we certainly know that the risks of this pathogen are infinitesimal for children, and there's no justification for deploying these products into the pediatric population at this point in time.
Thank you. Would you say that the strategy behind the mass vaccinations have been successful or are successful?
The strategy for mass vaccination has not been successful on multiple levels. The uptake of vaccines and boosters now in the United States is in the range of 14 to 15%. The majority of the population is not accepting these boosters. The uptake into the pediatric population in the United States has also been very small. So by the metric of was success, the ability to get jabs into arms, there was a significant initial success of something like 60 to 70% of the population in the United States and many other Western nations, in which then rapidly tapered off as more information became available about the risks and lack of benefits of these products. The campaign to administer the product was a success in places like Israel and Portugal, as measured by the willingness of the population to take the product. Was the campaign a success in terms of mitigating the risk of infection, replication, and spread of the virus or achieving herd immunity? Clearly, it was a massive failure. Was the campaign a success in terms of mitigating the evolution of the virus? Absolutely, it was a failure. The evidence suggests that the vaccination campaign probably drove the further evolution of the virus to more vaccine-resistant mutants. So I would say a very mixed picture, and success is a function of how you define the endpoints. But if the endpoint is willingness of the population to accept this technology now and in the future,
the
mRNA technology now and in the future, I would say it's been a massive failure globally. And in terms of the impact on the public health enterprise and vaccines in general, it's also been a massive failure. The confidence of global and U.S. populations in vaccines in general and in public health have seen major deterioration as a consequence to the mismanagement, propaganda, and withholding of information that we've seen.
What do you think will happen here on from now on, so to speak?
At this point in time, in early 2023, the situation is very dynamic. It's hard to predict what summer, fall, and winter will look like. It's always possible that we might have the evolution of a more potent viral strain. That's always a possibility, and we can't neglect that. In terms of the willingness of the World Health Organization and governments to become more transparent about what they have done, what's transpired, and what the data are, I don't see a willingness to disclose the decision-making, the policy, the basis for the policy, the influence of third parties, the conflicts of interest. I see a lot of evidence of denial and efforts to cover those things up. What happens now is going to be very much a function of whether or not the European Union and the United States government will be able to reassert the rule of law and engage in investigations that will lead to documentation and disclosure of what has transpired. In the case of your commissioner, I think it's Ms. von Leyden, she's clearly destroyed evidence in deleting the email correspondence that she had with Boria, and that must have consequences.
Borla, you mean
Borla, the Pfizer executive.
Yeah, the CEO of Pfizer. Thank you.
And so that must have consequences if we're to restore integrity to the European Union and Commission and to that office. I just can't predict. Are we going to see a doubling down on the propaganda and kind of totalitarian control efforts, information control efforts, and information warfare efforts? Or are we going to see an opening up and increased transparency? If there was to be increased transparency and more full disclosure of what's transpired, I think it would be probably destabilizing. And there's no way that can happen unless the European Union and the U.S. government and other governments are forced to do it. They will absolutely not do it voluntarily.
What are we supposed to do? Would you say, like, what can ordinary people do, so to speak?
So for the average person, ordinary people, I don't think anybody's ordinary, but I'm sure you didn't.
Sorry, the common man.
You didn't.
Sorry, my English is.
Yeah, it's okay.
You
didn't. I know you didn't mean it that way. First off, there is an opportunity to learn what has taken place and to process the meaning of that. That's the reason why we've written the book, The Lies My Government Told Me and the Better Future Coming, is to help people to comprehend what has transpired globally and in the United States for all of us, and to think through what possibly can be done. And there's many actions that can be taken at this point in time as we look forward towards the rest of this decade, given what we've experienced to date. And they range from taking personal control of things like your own food supply and preparing for potential economic difficulties that we may all face, through to political actions that might be taken, and to economic actions that individuals can take to secure their own finances. I think one of the things we've learned, for instance, with what happened when Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland turned off bank accounts for the Canadian protesting truckers, is we learned that we all now must take personal responsibility for securing our financial well-being and sustainability in ways that we never thought we would need to in the past. We've learned that we can't trust banks. That creates all kinds of difficulties, as just one example. Growing your own food and learning that and building those skills to become more self-reliant is another thing that we can all do. Becoming educated about these plans that have been developed over decades at the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, and how they're being deployed, and getting engaged politically. If you support those plans, then you should support them. Many of us don't, and I think that it behooves you, if you don't want your children to live under a command economy of a centralized global organization that's unelected. I call that indentured servitude under a Marxist, socialist, utilitarian structure. If you don't want your children to live in that world, you have to get engaged now. There's no time left. So there's a number of individual actions. And of course, as I advocated today in my talk, learning the technology of fifth generation warfare that's been deployed on all of us, and the methods of fifth generation warfare, and then practicing it as you speak to colleagues in line at the grocery store, interactions in social media, in your daily life with your mother or your uncle or your child, being honest and truthful, but forthright in communicating what you know and what you believe, I think is essential right now. Don't hide, and absolutely seek out community. It's community-based people, folks that have organizations, often people that are part of religious communities, that all over the world have been resistant to a lot of the propaganda that has been deployed on all of us.
I totally agree with you on almost everything you said. Basically everything.
Cool.
It's we have to do all of those things. So my first question of the two last ones now, that has to do with psychological warfare. My first question there is, would you say that it's going on a lot of psychological warfare, psyops, etc., towards the public nowadays on a global level, and also on country level, in mostly Western countries, I would presume. But what's your take on that?
We have experienced over the last 3 years the most globally coordinated, harmonized, intentional propaganda campaign in modern history in the Western world. The messaging has been harmonized, the techniques have been harmonized, the targets have been harmonized, the strategies have been harmonized. It has been an amazing, massive campaign globally. And I've had the privilege of traveling a fair amount in Europe and North America over the last 2 years, but last year in particular, and I have been struck by how the same exact methods of suppression of physicians, suppression of free speech, down to the level of specific wording like the dirty dozen, has been deployed in individual nation states all over the world.
Sorry, can you elaborate more on the dirty dozen?
Dirty dozen was a strategy that was deployed by the White House and also by the Italian press, in which 12 people. In the case of Italy, it was 10 people were identified as the leading spreaders of mis and disinformation. So those were labeled as the dirty dozen. The point is that the exact same wording was used, the phrasing and framing was used identically in Italy and in the United States, which clearly demonstrates harmonization and coordination.
On a global level?
On a global, that's why I say United States and Italy. At the global harmonization, particularly in the Western nations, and most specifically in the Five Eyes nations. I covered this in the lecture. The Five Eyes nations is the treaty, intelligence treaty that binds Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and
UK, perhaps?
UK.
So the Anglo-Saxon countries.
Yep. And then in terms of your second question, which was, about the infiltration and disruption strategies, there's
and also about regarding controlled opposition.
Yeah, which is saying the same thing. There are individuals who have been now well documented as being involved in disruption, chaos, and controlled opposition campaigns in both Europe and the United States and Canada. Some of those individuals that have been documented by a group called the Themis Project. It's affiliated with Children's Health Defense in the United States.
Can you please repeat the name?
Themis, Themis Project, have documented specific individuals and coordination between U.S. agents and EU-based agents. So there's no question that these people exist. They have infiltrated. For instance, one of them has been hired for quite a while now as the leading social media manager for one of the physicians identified as one of the key leaders in the United States. This person was actively involved in disrupting both the Canadian and the American truckers' movements. So we have clear evidence that there are intentional agents acting that have infiltrated, that are acting as chaos agents or disruptors, consistent with known propaganda techniques. And then we have many others that are more adventitious, that are exploiting this opportunity to advance their own initiatives or agendas, or advance their own personal fame as alternative journalists, etc., by building outrage and making spectacular claims, often at the expense of others.
But would you say that they're controlled opposition, or are they just trying to
That's what I'm saying. For these people, so there are absolutely those that are clearly identified as controlled oppositions, and then there's others that seem to be opportunists and may or may not be influenced by. There seems to be an ecosystem of chaos and disruptor agents that are active in this space, and then you can think of it as a circle around them of susceptible individuals that may have character weaknesses or
because
be very.
That's what the intelligence secret police, so to say, they usually
That's exactly right.
They take advantage of people that are usually
that have a weakness of some kind or a need for
narcissistic or
exactly.
Bad,
so there are circles around these disruptor, more professional agents or persons that are individuals that are more easily influenced, that basically may not even be aware that they're acting on behalf of the opposition. They may believe that they're acting with integrity against valid threats, but often those threats are promoted by these chaos agents that are often at the center of it.
Just one last question. It's a follow-up question regarding what you were just talking about. Would you say that there's also the form of controlled opposition where they're not supposed to disrupt, they're not supposed to sorry, that they rather are supposed to actually, in the beginning, seem to be doing something that is very good, and by doing so, they get a lot of followers. They get a lot of, they got a
I understand.
legitimacy.
So there's a wide variety of strategies.
Just let me finish the question, please. So that in the end, then in a very critical situation, in a critical turn, they will then give the wrong information to the populace to lead them in the wrong direction.
I think that there is a paranoid fear that this may occur often, and it often is used to justify the blackjacketing, as I discussed, of individuals. This paranoid fear that something might occur, they might turn on you at some point in time. And to evaluate that, I think it's important to kind of think through, how would that manifest? Is the individual that you're imagining, whoever that person is, are they in a position to make an impact should they so decide? So, for instance, if one was to take myself as an example, if I was to suddenly say, out of the blue, oh, I've changed my mind, everybody should take the mRNA vaccine because Pfizer was really surreptitiously paying me, then suddenly I was doing Pfizer's bidding when I hadn't been doing it before. The probability that anybody would act on that, I think, is pretty modest. And I know personally the probability of me doing that is non-existent. But it's always, I think you can't eliminate the risk that someone might be a turncoat. It's always there, but I think that more useful is to evaluate each situation for yourself, think for yourself, and the best way to protect against chaos agents and other propaganda disruption techniques is to be fully informed and use your own personal agency to think for yourself, make your own decisions in a decentralized way. Don't be a follower, be independent. Live in a decentralized decision-making space. And if that's the case, if you have a wide group of people that are all processing information and thinking for themselves as opposed to just following another trend or another central leader, then that's the best way that we can fight against these various campaigns of blackjacketing and disruption, etc., is to have for all of us that are, let's say, awake and resisting, to take personal responsibility for evaluating information independently. And don't just retweet things. Make sure that if you're going to repost some information, that you've taken a moment to verify that it is what you think it is and that it's what you want to say. And I'm guilty of just in a rush retweeting things and then having somebody point out that I got it wrong and I have to go back and delete it. It happens. But I think if we all take personal responsibility to the best of our ability to make sure that we don't pass on incorrect information and we think for ourselves, that's going to be our best protection against these infiltrators and disruptors and chaos agents.